Hi folks, welcome to my channel where today I am painting lesson 5 in my watercolour trip to Italy painting book. If you want to catch up with previous step-by-step lessons, I'll put a link to those at the end of this video. Today we're going to be painting an Italian bell tower or campanile, which I have to admit didn't look too inspiring on first glance, but today was the day when the penny dropped, light dawned, something clicked, and I felt progress was finally made. And as I go through the video, I'll try and explain when and how this happened and what I learned. Now, in previous lessons, I've had a quick skim through the lesson prior to painting, more to see what the painting was of and what supplies were needed than reading through the step-by-step instructions. But today I did actually read through the steps first. In past lessons, I've had a few issues with understanding instructions, so I thought it made sense to be a bit more prepared this time. In this lesson we'll also be using the wax resist technique that we first tried in lesson 4. So let's get straight into it and have a look at the reference photo of the bell tower and how it's been painted in the example. As I've noticed in previous lessons, the artist's impression is quite a bit lighter than the actual reference photo, but we've got 2 attempts to have a go at it, and I've started off as I did before by taping off the first of the 2 pictures just to get some nice clean edges. I'm going to be using the 2 brushes that came in the kit, as well as my own 1/2" flat brush, which came in really useful last week and was helpful for more quickly filling in the backgrounds. So let's get straight on with step 1, and the first part says to pre-wash the sky, mountain and lake areas. So it looks like we're going to be using the wet in wet technique. So for this to work really effectively, it was important to look at step 2, which is to wash the sky as well, and this is using a lot of water. So I decided to make the best use of my time to mix up this colour first. In that way I could benefit from the wet in wet technique and my paper wasn't drying before I'd actually mixed the colour. And as with previous lessons, there was no indication as to how much of each colour to mix, and so I've generally been eyeballing it and guessing from how the paint turned out in my palette. What I did notice was that often the paint mix in the palette looks more like the reference picture than the artist's final impression. But something I thought of doing this time, which did really help, was to swatch out the paint that I'd mixed on a separate piece of paper, because paint does look differently when you lay it down on paper to how it appears in the palette. And in this way I was able to gauge whether I needed to add more of one colour or the other to get the result that I wanted. I opted for a colour that was somewhere in between the reference photo and the artist's image, and then set about pre-wetting my paper using my flat brush. This enabled me to quickly and evenly cover the area that I needed to. With the background as evenly wet as possible, it was then time to add in that mixture for the sky. And I carried on using my flat brush for this because I was conscious that I had to work quite quickly. The second part of this instruction was to add some clouds whilst the paper was still wet. Now, if I was creating clouds myself, I'd probably have used the lifting technique to pull out some of that pigment to leave white clouds, but the instruction here was to add in some cadmium yellow. And that was a bit surprising because I just assumed that the blue and yellow together would make green. So that's something that I need to look into. It must be something to do with the different pigments, but it did actually leave quite a nice colour. So next we had to fill in the mountain using a mixture of ultramarine blue, yellow ochre and a bit of burnt umber. And again, like with the sky, this was to be done with quite a lot of water, and whilst this is still wet we had to drop in some yellow ochre for the rocks. So I mixed up the colour as instructed and laid it down onto the paper, and it did look very pale. So as much as it looks similar to the reference image, I think it's going to dry lighter, and that's something I might have to bear in mind for the next painting. So whilst this is still wet, I had to add in some yellow ochre just to put in those rocks in the mountain. Next we had to wash the lake with ultramarine blue, viridian and yellow ochre. and this looked like quite a nice colour until I added the yellow ochre, which turned it very green. And at this point it didn't look at all like the artist's image. So I did as I'd done before and swatched it out on my watercolour paper and decided as a result to add more ultramarine blue. It was fairly similar to the reference photo, but it wasn't quite how I wanted it to be. So after a bit of experimenting with different mixes and different proportions of those colours, I was finally getting a colour that I was happy with that fell somewhere in between the reference photo and the artist's image. And this is when the penny dropped, because with watercolour it is a transparent medium and you can get some really lovely luminous results. But what I wasn't considering was that there's already a colour down on our background, so that would shine through. So it's not always the best way to actually mix the paint that looks right on a white piece of paper if you're covering over something that's pre-done in a different colour. So with that epiphany, it was then time to move on to the next step, which was to paint the roof. And again, this is a very light wash of yellow ochre and a bit of raw umber. Then we had to wash the tower with cadmium yellow and yellow ochre and a lot of water. And this was something that I picked up on in lesson 4. On the actual reference photo, you could see that there was more colour than the final artist's version of it. So I was a bit hesitant to add too much colour, as I wanted to maintain some of that white of the paper to make the painting really pop at the end. I was aware though that watercolour dries lighter, so I did put some colour on there. I just didn't want to put too much. So we're on to step 2 now, and I thought before I got started I would read out the whole of step 2 just to familiarise myself with what was going to be involved in this one. So first off, we had to wash the cypress, and then we had to wash the core shadows on the tower. Then we were going to get to use the paraffin wax, which I'd enjoyed in lesson 4, and it gives us instructions on how to apply that, so which sort of strokes and things. So then we had to use the paraffin wax also on the wall and a bit of the shadow on the left part of the tower. And because these areas were a little bit more detailed, I decided to go back to the brush that came in the kit, which is this size 6 round. For the cypress tree, we had to add a 3-colour mix of burnt umber, viridian and cadmium yellow, and the instruction was not to add too much water here. And with my newfound realisation about the whole properties of watercolour thing, I had to remember whilst I was mixing this colour that I was actually going to be laying it over colour that was already down, so the blue of the lake and also the grey blue of the mountain behind it. So I did do a few colour swatches on my scrap piece of watercolour paper and did struggle to get the colours dark enough. It also had to be strong enough to cover up that line that was in between the lake and the mountain. So I did a few test swatches and was finally happy with a colour that I could use. I still think it came up quite watery though, and didn't really seem to cover up that line too effectively. And looking at their picture in the artist version, it did look a lot darker and a lot more opaque than my tree ended up looking. But having read through the instructions previously, I knew that we could add some more shadows to it later on in step 3. So the next part of this step was to wash the core shadows on the tower. And this was a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. For the next 2 steps I had to apply the paraffin, and for the area on the roof this needed to be done on the edge of the paraffin using diagonal strokes. I also had to apply it a bit more chaotically on the shadow on the left side of the tower. What I did try and do for this bit was to look at the artist's final painting and use the wax on areas that I wanted to preserve. And it wasn't until this point that I realised I'd missed out some of the background in the very first stages. And that was in this window here, so luckily I still had some of the paint mix on my palette and I could just fill it in. So now we're finally on to step 3 of the painting, and because there were quite a few instructions to this part, I thought it would make sense to prepare myself and read them all through in one go. In that way I could make sense of anything I wasn't sure of before I started painting. So the first step was to wash the roof, so hopefully that would reveal our nice paraffin technique and add some darkness to the cypress. We then had to wash the bright part of the walls and use the Varcolor technique in step 3 to add accents to the roofs. We then had to wash the house on the left hand side and darken up some core shadows. Last of all, we had to use the blur technique on the edges of the mountains. For the colour of the roof I had to mix up 3 colours, so that was yellow ochre, cadmium red and burnt umber. And I have to say, so far in this kit I have been really impressed with the quality of the paints, but more recently I've noticed that the burnt umber in particular is quite a weak brown, certainly compared to the stronger colours like the cadmium red that I'm using to mix the roof colour here. Nonetheless, because I'm more aware of that now, I can account for it in my colour mixing and only needed to add a really tiny amount of the cadmium red to get a really nice colour for the roof. And when I applied it down, I was still really pleased and excited by the way that the wax resisted that paint and showed through to give a really nice texture on that roof. Now it was time to add some shadows onto that cypress tree using a 2-colour mix of Viridian and burnt umber. And again I did have to mix in quite a lot of the burnt umber to get it to have an effect on the overall colour. But I was quite determined to get a darker shadow colour, so I did have a few attempts and tested it out on my paper until I was happy with what I've got. I also had to remember that there was already some colour down on the paper, so the transparent colour would show through. Moving on to the next step, and that was to partly wash the bright part of the wall, again with burnt umber and yellow ochre. And I was pretty pleased with how this turned out, because I was worried that it would be too dark a mix or that I hadn't applied enough of the paraffin to make the tower look nice and bright. With that done though, it was then time to add accents to the roofs using the Varcolor technique with Madder Lake Deep and the burnt umber again. So as I said before, we didn't need much of the Madder Lake Deep because it was quite a strong colour and needed to mix in more of that burnt umber to get it to have an effect on the overall colour. I wasn't too sure about the way I'd applied this because it did look a bit too bright and less orange than the one in the artist's impression. But that's something that I can try to improve on in the next painting. We needed to mix up burnt umber and yellow ochre to partly wash the house on the left side next. And then it was time to darken the core shadows of the tower itself using a 3-colour mix of burnt umber, viridian and raw umber. I was quite pleased with how the tower was looking by this point, and all I had to do now was to wash the lines on the wall, and that was using burnt umber and yellow ochre and quite a bit of water. All that was left to do now was to wash some dark waves on the lake using a mixture of ultramarine blue and viridian. Now so far this week the instructions had been fairly straightforward and I'd managed to follow them as accurately as I think I could. But one thing I did notice was, with one step to go, that there was no mention of putting in that bell. Being that this was a bell tower, I thought that was quite important, so I decided to add that in one of the colours that I got left over on my palette. However, it did mean that I forgot the last step, which was to partly blur the edges of the mountain, sky and lake. But never mind, we can do that in the next one. I was pretty pleased with how it turned out on the whole though. There were a few changes that I wanted to make, such as darkening up the mountain in the background and just doing a little bit darker on the side of that tower as well. I also really wanted to try and get a stronger green for the cypress tree and maybe adjust some of those colours on the roofs. On the whole though, despite not being too inspired by this painting in the first place, I do feel that coming out of it I felt a bit more confident, I understood the instructions better, and I do feel like the penny dropped a bit so far as transparency and watercolour are concerned, so there's things that I'm going to take forward into my second attempt to hopefully make it better still. So on this attempt I really tried to be a bit bolder with colour, especially on areas that looked too pale in the first attempt, like the mountains and the rocks. As you can see on the first attempt, there's not much distinction between the sky and the mountain, and there's not really any evidence now it's dry that I had put in any rocks at all. So that was one area that I really tried hard to improve on this time. What I've learnt about watercolour is that, as with any medium, you can read, watch and learn the theory, but you learn most when you actually practice it yourself. Until today I thought I knew more about watercolour than I evidently did. Watercolour has its own distinct properties, and to get the best out of those properties you need to experiment and play around with the transparency, layering and colour mixing to best show them off. Maybe there never is a point where you finally know everything about watercolour, and it takes people years to master the art. I've still got much to learn, but gradually I do feel like it's all falling into place. I did still forget to fill in the background behind the window on this attempt, even though I had pre-wetted my paper, but as before I did add it in with some pre-mixed colour on my palette. I did remember to add less paraffin wax on the core shadow of the tower though, and this enabled me to get a darker shadow and more contrast in my painting. I also made more of an effort to use less water when mixing the colour for the shadow area on the cypress tree to get that stronger colour that I was after. In my second attempt I also wanted to change up the colour of the roof to make it a bit more natural and in keeping with the artist's reference photo rather than the artist's painting. I did this by adding slightly less cadmium red and was much more happy with how it turned out. I also really liked adding in the darker core shadow area to the tower and really think that it helped make the painting come to life. Finally, to finish off this painting, and despite there not being an instruction to do so, I did still put that bell in the bell tower. However, it didn't stop me remembering to do the blur technique, which I'd forgotten on attempt 1. The blur effect, where you add clean fresh water to soften out some of those edges, is one that I've avoided in the past, as I don't like the cauliflower effect that it can produce. But in this case today it did soften out those edges really nicely and give a really nice texture to the top of the water and the edge of the mountains. After finishing both of these attempts I definitely prefer the second one, but I'd love to know which one you prefer and why. If you haven't seen the lessons 1 to 4, then I will put them in a link that you can click on and go and watch now. I've also got a video where I used the wax resist technique to draw a turtle, so that's a bit of fun, and if you'd like to see that video I'll also put it above in a link. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!